In the first two parts of this unit, we talked about ecosystems, the flow of their energy and the flow of matter within them through trophic diagrams and then, of course, through cycles. However, sometimes ecosystems experience this major disturbance and disruption, and it alters how they operate. Whether it be on a short-term or a long-term scale, ecologists are really interested in how these disturbances affect the flow of energy and the flow of matter through an ecosystem. More specifically, they're interested in whether or not they can resist the impact and if they can recover to their natural or original conditions. Perhaps you remember recently here in 2012, Hurricane Sandy, which just devastated the New York and New Jersey seaboard. It was just a tremendous amount of damage, and the local ecosystem there was essentially destroyed. Since 2012, that system has been monitored to see how well it bounces back. In this video series, we're going to talk about how ecosystems respond to disturbances, and you should be able to distinguish between ecosystem resistance and resilience. Explain how insights are gained from watershed studies, also part of what we'll be doing in this course, and then explain the intermediate disturbance hypotheses. Hurricanes, ice storms, tsunamis, tornadoes, volcanic eruptions, forest fires. These are all things that can be called disturbances because they are events caused by either some sort of physical, chemical, or biological agent that results in a change in the population size or in the community of any sort of ecosystem. Disturbances are also, they can be due to anthropologic causes, such as human settlements, agriculture, farming processes, air pollution, forest clear cutting, the removal of entire mountaintops to mine for coal, phosphorus, and anything contained within it. These are all signs of disturbances. But not every ecosystem disturbance is a disaster. The resistance of an ecosystem is measured by how much a disturbance can affect the flow of energy and affect the flow of matter within it. When a disturbance influences populations and communities, but it has no effect at all on the overall energy and matter flow of a system, we say the ecosystem has high resistance. Now, the rate at which an ecosystem returns to its original state after the disturbance has been terminated, we call that resilience. A high resilient ecosystem returns to its original state really, really quickly. Something that is less resilient does that far more slowly. So, for example, imagine a severe drought has eliminated half of the species in an area. And in a highly resilient ecosystem, the flow of energy and matter would return to normal in about a year. If something is less resistant, then the flow of energy and matter, essentially original conditions, may not return for many years, 100 years. It's the return to that pre-drought condition that determines an ecosystem's resilience. A field of growing interest in ecology is a discipline we call restoration ecology. Restoration ecologists are currently working on two high-profile ecosystems and projects. So like right now, two close ones I can think of are the Florida Everglades and Chesapeake Bay. There's ecologists out there who want to restore water flows and nutrient inputs into those historic sites and get them functioning back to their original condition. So understanding how disturbances affect the ecosystem process is multi-dimensional, I guess you could say. Understanding the natural rate and pattern of any biogeochemical cycling in an ecosystem provides a basis for determining how a disturbance has changed that system. And because it's difficult to study biogeochemical cycles like on a large scale, like on a global scale, most of the research has to take place on a smaller scale, where scientists can measure things and determine things. Scientists commonly conduct studies in what we call a watershed. A watershed is all of the land area and land mass area in a given landscape that drains into a particular stream, river, or lake where water collects. Hence, just another reason why our wetland monitoring is all that more important, because this is the scale that affects the larger scale. We now know of all the important things that a wetland does, and restoring wetlands to original conditions is a high priority for most state governments. Up until recently, wetland areas were just thought as useless, useless spots that you couldn't build on them, you can't boat on them. So people used to just drain them and bulldoze them. But we now know that they are important sinks for plant species. They are nurseries. They contain a huge amount of stored sulfur and phosphorus and other things that we want to keep in that system and not leak into our water system. They have a lot of important value. And so wetland restoration is one of the ecological restoration fields that is ultimately booming right now. Watershed studies are so vast and so different based on where they're at that most governments need citizen help in order to cover such a landscape. You will learn through the process of AP Environmental Science how we do that, how citizen scientistship works, and you'll be a piece of this larger puzzle in collecting data in watershed studies that affect a global restoration process. The most famous wetland restoration ecosystem project is the Hubbard Brook ecosystem. This has been going on for more than 50 years. This is an ecosystem in New Hampshire that in 1963, researchers actually clear-cut one side of the mountain, and the other side of the mountain was completely logged and sprayed with herbicide in the early 1960s. And so researchers decided that they were going to compare the two landscapes, and on purpose, they actually logged this left side over here, the side that's a little more clear-cut. They logged that. And then they began to monitor it, and they've been monitoring it for the last 50 years. They're basically investigating the effects of clear cutting and how that suppresses plant regrowth. One of the interesting things about that particular land area is that the soil underneath that watershed is impermeable bedrock. And there's really no deep percolation of water that goes into the aquifer system underneath it. So all the water that basically falls on that watershed, if it doesn't evapotranspiration, through plant processes, it basically goes into runoff. And so scientists, they measure the precipitation throughout each of the watersheds on the left and the right side of the screen there. The left side being the scientist-controlled one, and the right side, probably draw that, the right side right here being the Clearcut Forest in 1963, I think is when they finished clear cutting it. And then this part right here, more definitely that area, is the one that scientists did on purpose. And they're wanting to study how they can compare the two areas. So on that same watershed, there's a control area where they didn't clear cut anything, and then they just monitor that. So the concentration of the nitrate in the water was similar in the two watersheds before they clear cut it. And within about 6 months after scientists clear cut an area, they basically showed this huge significant increase in stream nitrate concentration. So with that information, these scientists were able to determine that when there's no trees present to uptake nitrate from the soil, nitrate basically leaks out into the watershed and ends up in streams and drains. So this study has subsequently demonstrated the importance of regular planting, replacing plants, and the cycling of nutrients. As luck would have it, nature favors an intermediate level of disturbance. We call this the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. We got real creative on that one. All right, this hypothesis, it speculates that an ecosystem, if it experiences not too high but not too low levels of disturbance, then it's more likely to grow back more diverse than it ever was. We now know that not all disturbances are bad. In fact, some level of disturbance is natural and necessary to maintain, species diversity. All right, so in the graph, you can see an illustration of this relationship between ecosystem disturbance and species diversity. Ecosystems in which the disturbances are rare experience this intense competition among species. So essentially, very, very stable ecosystems have a high level of competition. In places where disturbances are extremely frequent, an organism must have a high enough population growth rate, essentially, to live there. Those species are few and far between, so that is less diversity in those particular areas. So in this diagram, you can see this is a marine snail, and there's different amounts of herbivory present in this marine snail based on the richness of the algae that's there. So the relationship is together where there's a low number of different species of algae, there's a small snail density. Where there's a high richness of species diversity, there's also a low density of snails. Where the species of algae are intermediate, what this particular scientist here is considering intermediate, we see the highest amount of snails per meter squared. This is a fascinating field of science. When I lived in the islands, I knew a marine biologist who would glue little microphones to marine snails. Marine snails in particular, like this one here in the picture, they're grazers. They have little teeth, and as they go across the bottom, you hear crunch, 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 crunch. They're like basically like little tiny lawnmowers, and he would just listen to how they ate and map all of that. It's kind of the weirdest thing I've ever seen. It's probably why I didn't date really any scientists that listen to snails eat all day. But it was just fascinating to me how we knew where all of the their eating or dinner areas took place. We could predict the plant growth that was there, which was pretty cool. And someone made big bucks on listening to them eat all the time, though, which is kind of a little weird. But anyway, response to disturbances.